Okay, Michelle.
So we are here to launch the practical guide to the new supported decision making.
So we've spent 18 months, maybe more, working with partners from around the country to create this resource, and we are really excited to be here with you to launch it at last. Our wonderful colleague Jo Giles, who works with Paradigm, is the woman who listened to everything that was said and pulled the information together and created this very interactive resource that we're going to launch and share with you today. So thank you, Jo Giles.
And so coming soon is going to be the Welsh version of the practical guide.
Thanks to Catherine and Mark in Wales from Flintshire, who are one of our partners who are helping us make this possible. So today, a very simple flow, and we're really excited because we don't need to do much, do we, Michelle?
No, not a lot.
No, it's good. So when Michelle and I just be quiet in a minute, we're going to hand over to Sue. We will be quiet, won't we? Yes. We'll hand over to Sue and Lucy, who are going to be in conversation. We're going to have a couple of breakout groups, and the breakout groups are literally just 15 minutes for you just to go, whoa, what did I just hear? To talk to each other, to connect, to get ideas. We're not going to invite questions back because it's such a short launch, but our emails on our website if you want to get in touch at all. But it's really a chance for you to connect and unpick what you heard. And hopefully at the end of the day, think, actually, what more could I do after today to ensure that I really support people well to make decisions about their lives? So we're going to move to Jo Watson, who is from Melbourne, Australia, who's currently in Sydney, but she's with us already and we'll be hearing from her. Michelle and I will then give you a very brief tour of the guide. We won't go through the whole thing, you'd be glad to know, but we will highlight just some of the different ways that we've designed the information to help you engage with the information. And then Katie, our colleague, will talk about a training that we've designed to bring the practical guide to life.
So a little note, this is not a legal advice session.
We're being very clear about that, aren't we, Michelle? Because we ain't no lawyers, are we?
No, we're not.
We're really not.
No.
But if you do want legal advice, we highly recommend Cascadar. Their website's on the screen there, and they are just incredibly skillful lawyers. It's a charity there to campaign and support people to make sure they understand their rights, particularly under the Care Act, but also generally their legal rights.
Yeah, and please only use the chat for IT difficulties, only because some people might have difficulty reading what's in the chat, and also I'd like to make sure that people engage in what's going on with the launch of the practical guide today. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle.
So why are we here today?
Okay, so we are here to launch the practical guide. You may have got that message already. I think why did we create this is the question we're thinking about as well. In 2008, three amazing people created the practical guide to supported decision making that was published by Paradigm. They were Kate Fulton, Kelly Woodley, and Helen Sanderson. That practical guide has been on our website since 2008. And we've regularly heard from people that they found it really helpful. But we had a bit of a kick up the butt or a strong encouragement from someone called Liz Wilson, who said, come on, Paradigm, it's about time to update this guide. So thanks to Liz's determination and energy and boots up the butt, we've created this new resource with colleagues from around the country. And Liz has actually said about the 2008 booklet.
Yeah. The 2008 booklet has been the foundation of our family life and taken us through from early teens to adulthood, building my daughter's decision-making skills and holding my hands as I developed an adult relationship with my daughter, who has a significant learning disability. This new resource will give us a go-to resource in supporting families and colleagues to understand the beauty and the opportunity of supported decision-making, the forgotten gem of the Mental Capacity Act.
So huge thank you to Liz for the encouragement and support in making this possible. The whole of the resource has been driven and co-produced genuinely with the voices, experience, knowledge and insight of a range of people with a range of lived experiences. We have listened to people with learning disabilities, people like David, who said,
sometimes I rush into things and it goes pear-shaped. I don't think everything through. I want my supporters to help me understand the situation so that I can think through the right road for me. I want them to help me understand.
we also listen to many family members.
Our son has the right to be supported, to make decisions that are right for him and live the life he wants. As his parents, we can't let go until we know the right support is in place and people value and respect him like we do.
You can imagine the many people we spoke to, the distress, the concern for their own lives and the lives of people they love. So a huge thank you to the families and people with lived experience of learning disability and autism. But we also spoke to many support workers, personal assistants and other professionals.
Being able to support people in making decisions in their daily life is an opportunity to connect with people in a very personal, deep and meaningful way, to work in partnership with families, colleagues and the people you support. It opens up into a beautiful roller coaster ride with some amazing views.
All the conversations we had with many, many people over the last 18 months or more has been from the starting place that human rights are the foundation. Every conversation is based on the human rights are absolutely there. There are other laws protecting rights. And we're not sure, in those conversations, many people said, we're not sure that people realise that, sorry.
Supported decision making is a basic human right that is highlighted in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and is part of the Mental Capacity Act 2005 and the CARE Act 2014. It is not negotiable.
Thank you, Michelle. Very powerful message. We'll hear more about Mental Capacity Act later with Sue and Lucy as well.
So information is power. Information empowers. Information is powerless if not applied.
So again, the resource is about what are you going to do to use this information, to know the law, to make sure you do not keep eroding the rights of people we work for, or your, and make sure we get it right by knowing. Yeah.
Yep.
So who are these people, Michelle?
We want to say thank you to our incredible co-producers that helped us to create the practical guide.
Absolutely. Many, many online conversations, many, many debates, heated discussions, emotional debates. And when we asked people which page was their favourite, when we sent them a surprise gift box with a printed copy, did they all have the same page they liked?
No, not really, no.
No.
Thumbs up.
That's you with a thumbs up, Michelle, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
So basically, I think the resource will work in different ways for different people, depending on what it is you're looking for at that time. It's designed to be dipped into and used. And our colleagues, a huge thank you to you. And our partners.
A big thank you to our sponsors.
And that's North Wales Together, down in Flintshire, Exclusively Inclusive and Dimensions. Thank you so much. So we're not doing the tour now, are we, Michelle?
No, but we'll go through it a little bit later.
Absolutely. So now
we're going for a pause.
We're going to pause to give our colleague Rachel time to get ready to spotlight these two people. It sounds very trendy, doesn't it? Spotlight on Zoom. We're going to spotlight our colleagues, Sue and Lucy. We're going to hand over to them. So first of all, just by way of introduction, Sue, you'll see in a minute, is actually, I can show you this. There you go. There's Sue and Lucy before we show them in person. So Sue is a long-standing friend, challenger, serious challenger and supporter of Paradigm. She's also the chief executive of Aldingbourne Trust down in West Sussex. I have to say though, Sue is just as likely to be seen in a demonstration with a banner and a megaphone fighting for rights as she is to be seen behind a desk. That's who Sue is. And then we have Lucy, who we've got to know recently, and sorry, Dr. Lucy Series, get it right here. Sorry, Lucy. Lucy, who we connected with some years ago through Lucy's blog, The Small Places, that we think is a very direct and challenging and informative blog. But it really did challenge us to think a lot. So thank you for that, Lucy. And we really value Lucy's knowledge, challenge, and unrelenting focus on human rights. Everything's about human rights, and that's it. That's the challenge, that's the question. So over to Sue in conversation with Lucy, and we will stop screen sharing. Okay, over to you.
Lucy, do you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. Great. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here today. I'm Lucy. I am a researcher currently at Bristol University, an academic. I teach human rights and social care law and things like supported decision making to social work students, to doctors, to law students and all sorts. And my research focuses on the Mental Capacity Act and human rights. And I'm really particularly excited to be working with Paradigm because they're actually one of the groups that I've researched as being part of the story of the history of supported decision making in this country. So this is quite exciting for me to be here today.
Thanks, Lucy. And Sally, thanks for that introduction. I think everyone's got sort of an image of me now. Yes, I think that demo you were talking about was outside the Department of Health and Social Care, wasn't it?
It was. You were very, very loud, Sue. Louder than me, that says something.
Yeah. So I do like to make a bit of good trouble. Yeah, so as Sally said, I'm down in West Sussex and my organisation supports people, autistic people and people with learning disabilities with supported employment, housing, information advice and guidance, all sorts of things. But it's great to be here, particularly with Lucy, and to tease out some of the principles and the sort of tips, I suppose, and good practice around supported decision making. I was one of the people that have used the old guide and found it very useful within my organisation, but I absolutely love this new edition. And I like that it's got the emphasis on practical. It's packed with tips and tools, and we hope it will be very widely used. But maybe we should start, Lucy, just by thinking about what's the essence of supported decision making? That's a bit of a sort of mouthful, isn't it? Supported decision making. What is it we're talking about here?
Okay, thanks, Sue. I think the easiest way to explain what its essence is in terms of human rights and values is actually to start by thinking about how we got up this morning. So I woke up and I chose when to get up. And I chose what to wear and I chose what to have for breakfast. And I'm spending my day in a way that I've chosen. I live with people I've chosen to live with, and I live in a house that I've chosen to live in within the constraints of my budget. And I have all of these privileges in my life. My life is very rich in decisions. And that I think that's true for an awful lot of people. But it isn't true for some people with learning disabilities and autism, and some other people with cognitive impairments like brain injuries, for example. And that usually happens for two reasons that they might not have this richness of decisions in their lives. One reason is can be to do with money, that the people who pay for their care aren't providing enough to allow those carers to give those people meaningful choices. And the second reason has to do with people believing that those people can't make decisions for themselves and then occupying all those decisions for them. So jumping into the spot that would normally be the person's own and making that decision for them. And in law, we call that substitute decision making, when we're substituting our own decisions for a decision that the person would normally make themselves. So you can think of everybody carries around with them a kind of decision space, the space of decisions that they can make in their lives. And some people's is very expansive. and some people's is very constrained. And the essence of supported decision making is about trying to expand as much as we can people's decision spaces. And that has a legal dimension, but it also just has a practical dimension of how we interact with people on an everyday basis. And supported decision making, that phrase, comes out of work that was being done in the 1980s and the 1990s by organizations like Paradigm and some of your friends like Choice Support and a group that became known as Values into Action, who were trying to get people with learning disabilities out of some of the most cramped decision spaces imaginable, these horrible long stay hospitals, and give them lives in the community that had as much choice as most people would enjoy. And they developed this set of practices that they called supported decision making, because too often they were encountering people who said, look, this person can't make choices. They can't manage a budget. They can't choose where to live. And so they showed that if people are given the right support, and this was starting to happen around the world as well, there were developments in Australia and in Canada along similar lines, that actually people can make choices. And at the most radical end of the spectrum around supported decision making, that also includes people who even today might be seen as unable to make choices about their lives. So people with, for example, profound and multiple learning disabilities who might not communicate verbally. And it's about tuning into that person as best we can and trying to work out what decisions they are making and recognize those, and then trying as best we can to do what's called facilitated decision making. So making decisions that we think reflect our best understanding of who that person is and what helps them to flourish. So that's the essence of supported decision making.
Thank you, Lucy.
Sally, sorry, I just had a chat message saying, can we just slow down slightly, because the captions aren't easily keeping up. So, okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.
So Lucy, Michelle's already referred to the fact that there's some law supporting supported decision making, and you've referred to it. Can you just give us a bit of an overview of what the law is and what it's saying?
Yeah, so in human rights terms, there's a really important law called the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And this is a really incredible human rights instrument because it was actually created by disabled people for disabled people. It was signed in 2007 and the UK has agreed to it. And this law says that everyone should have a right to make decisions and be supported to make decisions and have their decisions recognised by other people in the same way that non-disabled people's decisions are. But unfortunately, that's the good news. The bad news is that the UN Convention, you can't actually, you can tell the government it should respect it, but you can't actually apply it in the courts in England for lots of complicated, boring legal reasons. But we have some good laws in England. They're not perfect, but they're okay. So one is the Mental Capacity Act. And the Mental Capacity Act is a law that says, so long as people have something called mental capacity, and that means the ability to understand a particular decision, to remember the information about that decision, to weigh that decision up, and then to tell people what they want, then they have the right to make decisions for themselves, even if other people think they're making unwise decisions. And that law says you can't treat someone as not able to make a decision for themselves unless you've supported them first, unless you've taken what's called all practicable steps to help them make that decision. So that's where this support principle in English law comes from. You've got to help someone as far as you can to make those decisions for themselves. And then we've also got the Care Act, which I think people forget about. So if you're involved in assessing people's needs under the Care Act or care planning under the Care Act, then there's lots of really good bits about the Care Act, about having to properly involve the person in that decision making and actually having to involve others in helping that person to understand what's going on. It's called the appropriate person. And that's because the Care Act says it's going to have supported decision making, should be running throughout the landscape of local authority care. And then we've got the Human Rights Act. So when local authorities haven't given people the support they need to make decisions, for example, around sex, The courts have actually said that this violated people's human rights, and the local authorities have had to pay damages to people for not helping them to understand and make decisions, including really tricky decisions about their lives.
So, I mean, with the Mental Capacity Act has been around for a while,
Mm.
and the Care Act has been around for a while. So there's the law. Why do we need a guide? Why do we need this guide to help supportive decision making to happen?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I think lots of reasons. I think the first thing we know is that the support principle is not actually being respected very well. So there's been lots of research around that, and there's also been some big kind of public inquiry type things where disabled people and their families told the government that actually they weren't being helped to make decisions. And sometimes people that wanted to help their family members to make decisions were being shut out by professionals. And we know from research that professionals find it really hard to support people to make decisions. And sometimes that's a lack of skills, and sometimes that's a lack of time and resource and enough time to build a relationship with people. So one reason is because we really need to put a spotlight on the importance of supported decision making and remind ourselves. But the other reason is this: the support that people need is going to differ. The support that somebody with, I don't know, a brain injury will need to make a decision is going to be quite different to the support that somebody with, say, learning disability or autism might need. The support that somebody with a mental health problem might need is going to be different to the support somebody with autism might need. And this guide is really focused on the experience that people involved with Paradigm have, including people with learning disabilities, in what helps people with learning disabilities. And I think we need more practical guides like this for all the groups who can benefit from supported decision making.
Lucy, who does the law apply to? Why has it been written?
I mean, it's a ginormous law. It's so big. So when they passed the law in 2005, the government estimated there might be 2 million people who might sometimes lack capacity to make decisions about their everyday lives. So that was people with dementia or learning disability, autism, brain injury, people who might have quite significant mental health problems. And so the law applies to them most directly because it says when they're allowed to make decisions and when other people can step into their shoes and make those decisions for them. But actually, we need to draw back a bit further, because actually the law also applies to anybody who's involved in caring for them. So that includes all the professionals, so all the health professionals and the care professionals. But it also includes families. And I think this is something that can be quite tricky, actually, because when your son or daughter, say, turns 18, you no longer have this legal right to make decisions for them, which parents have. And actually, the Mental Capacity Act is the framework that takes over. And so this guide, I think, is partly aimed at families. And it's really important that families understand the legal frameworks around how they can help people related to them make decisions and how they can advocate for them in their best interests if necessary.
Thank you. And I mean, we're talking about decision making.
Mm-hmm.
So what sorts of decisions do we mean? I'm just looking at the guide, and there's a decision flow chart in there on page 43. But could you just talk us through, you know, is this needed for every type of decision, or do we need to be especially careful around big decisions? Could you just talk about that for a while?
Yeah, okay. So when I say the Mental Capacity Act's ginormous, I really mean it. I mean, it applies to, let's start with the really big decisions, shall we? And then work our way down. So some of the really big decisions that the Act applies to is things like serious medical treatment. So that's situations where maybe a person might be in hospital and there's decisions about whether to continue their care or withdraw care. It could include reproductive decisions. So there are some cases about really difficult things like abortion and sterilisation. It applies if somebody's thinking about contraception for somebody. You should be looking at whether that person can make their own choices and supporting them to do so. So it applies to all the medical decisions, apart from those governed by the Mental Health Act, which is sort of hived off.
On that, Lucy, just thinking some of the stuff that happened during COVID.
Yeah.
around the do not resuscitate being
Yeah.
automatically applied. What was that? Okay, was that legal? Was that good practice?
No. So there's a lot of do not resuscitate. Some people call them orders, but they're actually just, they're advisory. That's the first thing. They're sometimes put on someone's file, but they don't stop somebody coming along and resuscitating. They're just a kind of note that a conversation should have been happening. There's lots of law around them, and they can be made for lots of reasons. So one of the reasons clinicians might put a do not resuscitate order on somebody's file is they think that resuscitation wouldn't work, that the person would still die, and they would die a pretty grim death. So that's what's called a clinical do not resuscitate decision. Another reason might be that they would recover, but they wouldn't recover to a quality of life that the clinicians think is worthwhile. And that starts to tread into the best interests territory under the Mental Capacity Act. And that means that we need to think about not just what the doctors think is a good quality of life, but what is a quality of life that's worthwhile to the person themselves. And clinicians should never, ever, ever be making that decision without talking to the person and talking to the family. And in fact, even if they're making a decision that they think the person wouldn't recover, the law still says the clinicians have to talk to the person if that person's got capacity and can understand. And if they can't, they have to talk to the family. And if they don't, that is a human rights violation that healthcare professionals have been forced to pay damages over for not doing that. And part of the reason for that is just, it's a point of respect. You know, it shows respect for a person to say, to tell them what you think their prospects of recovery are if you administer this quite brutal intervention to save their life. But also because the family or the person might have a different view. They might think, well, maybe I could recover, and they might want to seek different medical advice. So do not resuscitate decisions are complicated. There's lots of reasons why they might be made. But whenever they're made, there should always be a conversation with the person and their family, and there are steps they can take if they disagree with it. And it's always best to get legal advice if you're in that territory, I'm afraid. But yeah, I think in COVID, we understand that there was just mass illegality about all kinds of things, and that was one of those things. Yeah.
So hopefully that will be coming out through the inquiry.
I hope so. Yeah.
I interrupted you because you were talking about the sort of big decisions.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's one huge decision. If you'd like to sort of carry on and just explain more about the other end of the spectrum, perhaps.
Yeah. So another type of decision that might be made under the Mental Capacity Act, either we find that the person can make it if they're given support, or a best interest process might be initiated. So the other type of decision is around everyday care. So that could include where they're cared for. That's sometimes called residence. So that could mean things like, does the person remain living in their home or with their family? Or is there a move being considered perhaps to a care home or to supported living, or between care homes, perhaps even into hospital, although sometimes that might take you into Mental Health Act territory, which is a whole different ballgame. And if those decisions are being made, the same principles apply. You know, can the person make the choice for themselves? If they can, it's their choice. If not, there's a best interest process. And the other little warning I want to flag up there is, if you're in a situation where you're talking about caring for somebody in a setting where they're not going to be free to just leave if they don't like it, and if they did try to leave, someone would try and prevent them, that's very, very, very likely to be a deprivation of liberty in law, and there's lots of other human rights processes that have to be followed. That's not to say you can't do that. That's to say that we really need to make sure that decision's right, because it's so important that people have that right to liberty protected. Decisions about everyday medication, about restraint, those are also quite serious decisions that the Mental Capacity Act would govern. And then we get down to the everyday, decisions about money. So money decisions are a bit tricky, actually, because some people will get welfare benefits and they might be paid to an appointee. And there's hardly any law around that. And there's nobody really checking on that. And lots of people think that's a bit problematic. But people who have a bit more money than that might have lots of savings, for example, or they might have inherited some money, or they may have money through work. And if people think they can't manage that money for themselves, then they might need to have somebody formally appointed by themselves or by the court to manage their money for them. And that again would be under the Mental Capacity Act. And then we get down to the really everyday decisions, the ones I was talking about today, like when I get up, what I eat for breakfast. And unbelievably, even these are managed by the Mental Capacity Act. And sometimes we can think, do we really need law to tell us, about people's rights to make choices about what they eat and what they wear? And I think we do for two reasons. And the first reason is people with learning disabilities have had these everyday rights trampled on for decades, if not longer. So it's important to have a law that says actually it is up to them to make these choices so far as possible. The other reason is that even these things that seem quite mundane and taken for granted by all of us can be really, really serious. So I'll give you two examples. Some people have health conditions where if they eat the wrong thing, it can make them desperately ill. So actually having a discussion about whether they can make choices about whether to eat that thing or not, or eat too much or not, can be quite life or death, even though it's just choices about food. And the other thing is that even everyday choices can become desperately important to people. So there's been court cases about everyday choices as private as whether or not people shave their pubic hair. And that's because some people come from cultural backgrounds where pubic hair shaving is expected and normal. Care professionals weren't very comfortable with doing that. And so it ended up in court because there was a religious rights dimension to this. And the court had to make a decision about whether that should be done to a person or not. And it's very, very tricky. So even the most everyday decisions can be very, very important decisions and can create big conflicts if we don't sort them out. So it covers everything.
Yeah, thank you. You said that you're involved with teaching doctors and social workers, and certainly as a service provider, we've been involved with all sorts of agencies, including the police. And I think one of the examples that I gave is in the booklet around the police coming along and talking to a group of young people with learning disabilities about keeping safe in the community. And the policeman he thought he was being very helpful, saying to this group of young people, well, because you've got a learning disability, you're not allowed to have sex. So is he right?
I mean, if he was talking to a group of people with learning disabilities in the 1940s, he might have been right. That hasn't been right for a very long time. Because very unfortunately, we know that sometimes people with learning disabilities, particularly people in care services, can be sexually exploited. There is a law called the Sexual Offences Act, which says that if you have sex with somebody with a mental disorder impeding choice, which more or less means the person lacks the mental capacity to consent to sex, then that is a criminal offence. It's not a crime by the person who's got the learning disability, for example. It's a crime by the person who's having sex with them. However, the courts have interpreted that to mean that if a person with a learning disability or autism or some other condition, like say a brain injury or dementia, lacks the mental capacity to make choices around sex, those caring for them have to take all steps they can to stop them having sex. And this can often result in a deprivation of liberty or some really drastic interventions. So we've seen court cases where people were having sex. Some of them were married, and somebody decided that they lacked the mental capacity to consent to sex. And it's usually social services, but sometimes it's health services, came in and said, you're no longer allowed to have sex with your wife or your partner. They may have separated them and put them in separate accommodation. A person who might have been, catching the bus by themselves and going into town is no longer allowed to go out without someone with them. It has enormous consequences for a person if someone says they lack the capacity to consent to sex. And that's why the courts have also said, if you think that is happening, if you think that someone with a learning disability can't make choices around sex, it's usually the council, but it's also the NHS, has to take all practicable steps to help that person learn about sex, have some sex education, learn about how to make safe choices around sex. They might not be choices that everyone else agrees with, but they're informed choices. And there's the guidance on that changes quite regularly. So it's worth checking out what that says. But I think the key point here is if you have somebody who really genuinely doesn't understand what sex is, and somebody's doing that to them, effectively that's legally rape, and rightly so. But there is quite a grey zone in the middle where people who want to have sex find that their lives become very micromanaged, and that's where supported decision making around sex education becomes really important.
And this, the guide on page 13 talks about the traps that you can fit into around supported decision making. So it's not unusual to hear, I'm going back a few years now, thankfully, well, because they've got a learning disability, they can't make decisions. Is that true? Is that true across the board, Lucy?
No, I mean, I think for a very long time, people with learning disabilities have been assumed to lack the mental capacity to make choices. So if you go back again to the 1950s, where this policeman seems to have been still living, you'll find even in public policy papers, people with learning disabilities as being described as like children, as childlike, they'll just do what they're told. And the assumption there is they don't make decisions that other adults make about their lives. And part of the point of the Mental Capacity Act was this sudden almost realization that actually people with learning disabilities are equal citizens. They have human rights. When they turn 18, they are adults, and the normal rights that adults have apply to them. And so the Mental Capacity Act is partly about saying, look, just because someone has, say, a learning disability or dementia, you can't just continue treating them like a child or like somebody who can't make any decisions at all. If you are concerned about their decision making, you need to properly support them to understand that decision, to make that choice, and then you can assess whether they can make that decision for themselves. And even if they can't, it doesn't stop there. Even if they lack the mental capacity to, say, make a choice about where they live or manage their money, the law goes on to say people who make best interest choices for them have to involve them in that decision-making process. They have to help them participate in decisions about their lives. You have to consult with them about what they want. You have to talk to people that know them well about what they think they would want. And then when you're making that best interest decision for them, you have to really consider that. You have to really consider what the person wants. And there's this brilliant Supreme Court ruling by Lady Hale called Aintree, which is in the booklet. I've marked it. I can't tell you what page it is. I can tell you what page it is. It is on page 29. And it says it's about trying to stand in the person's shoes and think about the decision from their perspective.
I think when the Mental Capacity Act came out, it was welcomed by many people. And there are 5 principles, aren't there, that could be kind of like our touch points, really. If we're sort of working to those principles, we should be getting it about right, shouldn't we? Could you take us through those aspects? It's on page 17 of the guide, if anybody wants to have a look at those. Yeah.
So there are these 5 principles of the Mental Capacity Act, and they are, all of them are linked to human rights principles. I think it's important to say. So the first principle is called the assumption of capacity. And that's really what we were just explaining, which is about just because someone has, say, a learning disability, or just because someone's behaving in a way that we think means they might have problems decision making, we can't jump to the conclusion they cannot make the decision. And unfortunately, all too often, you do get this still happening, actually. I've got some colleagues who are doing some research on a dementia ward, and they've literally witnessed healthcare staff saying things like, oh, well, they can't make a choice because they've got dementia, or they can't make a decision because they don't know who the Prime Minister is. I mean, I think we're all having trouble keeping up with that these days. And you know, these are not good reasons to assume that someone lacks capacity. So the starting point is, you assume that the person in front of you has the same legal rights to make choices as you or I or the person doing that assessment. And then the second principle is, if you're in a space where you think, actually, I am a bit anxious, I'm not sure they completely understand this, or they're making such a risky decision, I want to really check that they've got that mental capacity, then the second principle that applies is the support principle. And that says, you mustn't treat the person as unable to make a decision until you've taken all practicable steps to help them make that decision for themselves. And that's the one that I think this guide is really, really strong in helping.
Yeah.
And then the third one, and I think this is a really hard principle in practice, is called the unwise decisions principle. So if you are given the frankly quite unenviable task of deciding whether someone making perhaps a really difficult decision has capacity or not. So let's say, let's go back to sex. Let's say someone wants to have a sexual relationship with somebody that we don't feel very comfortable about. Or let's say somebody wants to carry on living in a living arrangement that makes us uneasy. Or somebody wants to carry on doing something unhealthy, like smoking or overeating, say. That we can think of as an unwise decision. And the trick is to work out, is it an unwise decision that the person actually does understand all the consequences that are relevant and they can use and weigh them, but they still want to make that choice? Or is it that the person actually doesn't really understand the choice they're making, or for some reason they're not able to weigh up the consequences of that decision? And just as a note, weighing up the consequences of the decision doesn't mean weighing them up in the way that we want them to weigh them up. So to give you an example of that from court cases, there was an older person with dementia who'd been living in her own bungalow, and she had a fall and she ended up in hospital and then on this kind of conveyor belt into a care home where she was desperately unhappy and she wanted to go home. And the person assessing her capacity said, look, I don't think she really understands about going home because you know, she's not agreeing that she might, you know, fall and something terrible would happen to her. And the judge actually spoke directly to this woman, and she said to the judge, look, if I die on the floor, I die on the floor. I'd rather die on the floor in my own home than die in a care home. And she just attached a different weight to the outcome, to that the professionals wanted her to attach. So unwise decisions means sometimes making risky decisions, but really checking the person understands that.
And there's a good case study, I think, in the pack, isn't there, as well, about somebody and his preference to have a few beers every night.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we all make unwise decisions, don't we? And that's part of being an adult. And sometimes those risks happen. You know, sometimes, you know, we decided not to go ahead with that medical procedure, and then the thing our doctor warned us about happens to us. And we live with the consequences. And I think one of the things that makes this so hard under the Mental Capacity Act is it's not just that individual who has to pick up the pieces, it's the people around them. So I think part of this is about stepping back and supporting them as well to live with those consequences and live with uncertainty and risk. And that's why that's so hard.
Yes.
And then there's best interests. And I've got to say, I'm not a massive fan of best interests. It's language that most countries in the world that are into disability rights are moving away from. I know we've got someone from Australia here, so lots of places in Australia are moving away from best interests towards an approach that starts with doing what the person wants as long as they can, and only moving away from what the person wants if there's a really, really good reason to do so. I think best interests sounds a bit like what we talk about with children. I think too often it gives people carte blanche to decide what they think is best interests. And I think it'd be better to use language that is more about putting ourselves in the person's shoes and trying to think things through on their behalf, through their eyes. But we are where we are. And so the Act says if the person lacks capacity, then a best interest decision must be made on their behalf. And at the time when that was thought up, that was really progressive, because what would happen is if you had a learning disability, decisions might be made that weren't about you, they were about everyone around you. You know, they were about what your family want or the people caring for you wanted. And this is about saying, no, it's about that individual. And at the time, that was really radical. So best interest, and what I'd say about best interest is the principle is as good as the people making that decision. And it completely comes down to who's sitting in the driving seat. And if you occupy the driving seat of best interest decision making, you have a big weight on your shoulders. And yeah, I think it's important to really reflect on that. Yeah.
And there's one more principle, isn't there?
Yeah. So this is another sort of old school human rights principle that came out of deinstitutionalization and work across the Atlantic on getting people out of institutions. And it's called the least restriction principle. So this says, before you make a best interest decision, before you do something to someone in their best interest, you've got to think about all the different options and consider whether you could pick a less restrictive one. Okay, so let's think. Maybe there's some kind of risk that we're super worried about, and the nuclear option is to put somebody in a very tightly constrained residential care situation where there's always going to be somebody with them controlling what they do. Option 2 might be, maybe we could put them in a living arrangement that's a bit more relaxed and have some more tailored support to help them understand those risks. So it's about working our way down the spectrum and deciding on a better balance, perhaps, between risk and restriction. It doesn't mean, you have to pick the least restrictive option, because part of the Mental Capacity Act's function is protective, but it's about saying, look, if you're going to do something to someone that is constraining their decision space, constrain it as little as you possibly can, and always be looking for opportunities and ways to grow it and keep on growing it.
And who should be involved in supported decision making? Again, I am going back a few years, but it wasn't unusual to hear, well, let's refer them to the community team. Let's see if a psychologist can decide. What does the law say about who should be involved?
Well, I mean, I actually think this is another area where the Mental Capacity Act isn't as strong as laws in other countries. So I'll tell you what the Mental Capacity Act says, and that it doesn't actually say. That's the really tricky thing. So you've got this pyramid on, I'm going to try and find the pyramid. Maybe someone else could help find the pyramid while I talk. So there's a kind of pyramid of decision making, and essentially the way it goes is, if you're the person who would be assessing capacity and making the best interest decision, then it's your responsibility to make sure that all those practicable steps have been taken to support someone. And here's the but. That doesn't necessarily mean you're the best person to provide that support directly. Okay, it might be you. When you're doing that capacity assessment, you should be building in all the accommodations the person needs, finding the right time of day, communicating them in the best possible way. But it may be you have to go beyond that. So let's say you've got someone who's got a really significant communication impairment. You might want to look at involving speech and language therapy, or perhaps even tech specialists who can talk to you about, assisted communication. It might be that you've got someone's decided that's the capacity to make decisions around sex. You need to bring in a sex ed specialist who knows how to support people with learning disabilities to make those kinds of choices. And the other big one, and the Care Act here is much stronger, I think, than the Mental Capacity Act here, is the person's natural circles of support. So I think that there's a really unfortunate mindset, which is that supported decision making is yet another thing that professionals do to a person, elbowing everyone else out the way. And actually, that's not what the law says. And in fact, the Code of Practice and the new NICE guidelines on supported decision making say things like, start by asking the person how they want to be supported. And part of that is ask the person who they might want to be involved. That can mean involving someone's family or friends. It also might mean not involving them if the person doesn't want those people involved. It might mean involving an advocate. It might involve a key worker that person really trusts. And the Care Act literally says that the person has the right to have that person involved in the assessment, involved in the care planning. They're called the appropriate person. But from what little research has taken place on the Care Act, we don't actually think that's happening. And we think part of the reason that this isn't happening by local authorities is that there's a mindset in which mental capacity is still what a person is able to do on their own. And the law doesn't say that. It's not a maths test. We're not there like coaching the person, cramming them full of facts, and then stepping back and seeing how they do on their own in the maths test, because none of us make choices like that in our lives, do we? It's about a more complicated picture of capacity, which is seeing, well, how does this person make decisions in their natural environment? And that involves looking at the people around them who they would normally involve in that process.
So who decides?
Well, I mean, ultimately, if you can't all get along, the Court of Protection decides. And I know that's a bit of a nuclear option, but it is an area that I think needs a bit more stress testing and a bit more guidance from the court. If, say, you are involved in supporting someone whose capacity is being assessed, say by the NHS or local authority social care, and you feel that you or somebody else who would normally be supporting that person to make decisions is being shut out, then you need to use the Mental Capacity Act and guides like this to advocate for that person's right to say who they want supporting them. And if that's not happening, then I'm afraid it's all the usual processes. It's, complaints processes, ombudsman processes, court of protection processes, and that's not ideal. As yet another problem with the Mental Capacity Act is when things go, it's fine if everyone plays nice, but quite often they don't play nice, and that leaves people with a really difficult decision about how to stand up for people's rights. I think one thing that I've learned along the way is there is, within health and social care, there are a group of radicalized professionals. So they're people who were involved in the past, perhaps with things like Wolfensberger's training. They were people who were passionate about human rights. They're people who are really into the Mental Capacity Act. And if you can try and get hold of some of them within your local authority or or NHS Trust, so every NHS organisation should have a Mental Capacity Act lead. Local authorities will have specialist teams that deal with deprivation of liberty, which is about Mental Capacity Act stuff. You could try and get hold of them, see if they can broker some kind of mediation to resolve these issues.
The hierarchy that you were referring to is on page 27.
There we go.
There you go.
Yeah.
Is it important to record the stages of decision making?
Do you mean the stages of the assessment for whether someone can make decisions?
Well, any kind of aspect of it, really. Is that something that is recommended, or can it be done in a much more informal and casual way?
Yeah, I mean, the legal principles apply, whether the decision is, what pants, whether that person wears pants or whether they have life-sustaining treatment. So the same legal principles apply. So your starting point is always, this is the person's choice to make. If you have concerns about that choice, then the legal process around assessing capacity is technically the same. So talk to the person, work out what's their understanding of the situation, assist their understanding of the situation through whatever means you need to take. That could involve helping them think about the risks of deciding in a particular way. The other thing to say is there is a sort of legal test about the role that a person's disability plays in their decision making. This gets quite technical, so I really apologise for what I'm about to say. Okay, and the way it goes is this. There's what's called the functional test. And the functional test is, can the person understand the information? Can the person weigh up the information? Can they remember it all long enough to make the decision? And can they communicate their decision? If the person can't do one of those things, then they lack the ability to make a decision for themselves. Now, the really difficult thing is lots of people might fail that test in their everyday life. Okay. I can think of areas of my life, actually, where I suspect I probably don't have capacity to make a decision because I know that my decision making is quite irrational around certain things. And I have a legal right to make that bad choice that I lack capacity to make, because the reason I can't make it is not caused by a disability. And this is the bit that I think is potentially quite discriminatory about the Mental Capacity Act. The legal test of whether you lack mental capacity isn't just about whether you can't make a decision. It's about whether the reason you can't make that decision is caused by your disability. So to give you an example from case law, there was a woman with a learning disability who was in a sexual relationship with a really bad man. This is a man who had been sent to jail for domestic violence against other disabled women. He was coming out of jail. The question was, should she resume living with him, this terrible, terrible man? And she did not believe that he had committed the crimes that he'd been found guilty of. And so the argument of the council, who understandably wanted to protect her, was she can't make decisions about her relationship with him. She lacks capacity. And actually what the court concluded is, yeah, she is making some pretty dreadful decisions, but so do lots of women in relationships with violent, abusive men. And the reason she's making this terrible decision isn't to do with her learning disability. It's to do with this terrible relationship. And so actually, in law, she has the mental capacity to make that terrible choice. There are other cases about people who've made quite out there decisions because of their religious beliefs. I mean, if you look on the internet, people hold some really wacky beliefs about COVID measures. That's their right to hold those wacky beliefs. So it's about the connection between a person's disability and their being unable to make that choice. Yeah.
Thanks, Lucy. I think we've almost concluded, but I wondered whether you had, what are your reflections now? You know, you're in the world of supported decision making on this guide. How powerful and helpful do you think it might be?
I think it's great. I think it's great for loads of reasons. I think it's great because it's fun and enjoyable to look at and to read. I think the case studies really help. I think it's imbued with decades of experience of people who've lost their right to make decisions because other people have trampled on those rights, and people who've helped them and been their allies trying to reclaim those rights to make decisions. So I think it's really powerful, and it comes from a lot of lived experience, and that's the best starting place. And I think it will help people to do the best they can within the legal framework that we've got. I think the next step is to think about how that legal framework could be made better. Maybe that's a conversation for another day.
Thank you very much, Lucy. It's been a really interesting session. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue.
Thank you so much, Sue and Lucy. I'm sure your brains are buzzing. I'm sure you would love to chat with Sue and Lucy. We don't have time for that today, unfortunately, but we are going to invite you to go into breakout groups in a minute just to think about what did you hear then? Chance to chat about what you heard in that conversation, debate against each other. There might be connections in that group that'd be helpful for you moving forward as well. I know Lucy and Paradigm and others will stay connected. Lucy has lots of ideas about what needs to take place moving forward, don't you, Lucy? So maybe we'll be hosting other conversations in the future and we will let you know. I am really, well, we are really pleased now to welcome Dr. Jo Watson. Jo is from Melbourne, Australia, from Deakin University, but actually sitting in Sydney at the moment on a research project there. Glad it's not too late in the evening for you, Jo. So,
lovely.
Yeah, but Jo's a senior lecturer in disability and inclusion at Deakin University, Australia. We came across Jo, as I just said, via a friend and colleague in New Zealand, Carolyn, who's here today. So these wonderful connections that happen. And then we just got totally inspired to watching and listening and being challenged by Jo on YouTube in some of your talks, Jo, which have been really inspirational for many people. So thank you. But we're inspired particularly by Jo's very direct challenge to the assumption that people with severe or profound cognitive impairments, disabilities, are unable to lead self-directed lives. So Jo's challenge is real and honest and direct, and we welcome you now, Jo, to share your thoughts and challenge with us again. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. So I'm going to begin by acknowledging and celebrating the traditional owners of and custodians of the lands on which I join you today. Usually for me, those traditional owners are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in Naarm, which is Melbourne. But I'm about, as Sally just said, I'm about 1,000 kilometres north from Melbourne at the moment, in the lands of the Gadigal people, which is Sydney. And I'd like to recognise the traditional owners and their deep connection to these lands, air and waterways, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I'd like to recognise that Australian Aboriginal people have occupied and they've cared for this continent for over 65,000 years. As a non-Indigenous Australian whose ancestors arrived here on these shores courtesy of your British Crown, so thank you. It was a lovely gesture you gave me and my family. But I'm very much a guest on this land. This land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And the reason why I gave you, usually we would give an acknowledgement of country, but I gave you a little bit of a longer one. The reason why is because I think we have a lot to learn from Indigenous cultures across the world around supported decision-making, collective decision-making. As I said, Australia, well, I don't know if I have said, but Australia's Indigenous culture is the longest surviving culture on the planet. which is pretty cool. And this means that culture has existed as a continuous culture longer than any other living culture. And the reason why I bring that up is because what I know about Indigenous culture in Australia, but not all over the world, but what I do know about Australian Indigenous culture is that they perhaps were the very first supported decision makers. They have been supporting one another collectively to make decisions for 6,000 years. And Indigenous Australians describe and practice a really collaborative view of self-determination, a view that is regularly seen in non-Western cultures. So self-determination for these groups, for these cultures, are best realised collectively rather than what we see in the West individually. So I do acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. The Australian continent was and always will be Indigenous Aboriginal land. But I want to also reflect on what we have to learn from these thousands and thousands of years of learning and supported decision making. So here we are, here it is. So I was really thrilled to receive an email from Joe and Sally about this important resource. It's really important. And like Lucy has said, I too have used the old book, but this one is so exciting. The other one was great too, but this is really exciting. I visited Paradigm and Peter Kinsella, who many of you will know, who was the director of Paradigm many years ago. And I visited in 2005 on a study tour kind of thing. It was a short-term time before the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was born. And there's no question that the UK was leading the world in developing autonomy-based policy and legislation for people with cognitive and psychosocial disability through the Mental Capacity Act. And it was that act that took me to the UK. I really wanted to know what was going on, how at that point, I think I came early in the year in 2005, and then it was implemented later that year. So I got to talk to some people that Lucy will know about, and she'll probably have others to add to this list. But I got to talk to people who were instrumental in bringing the Act to light. People like Tony Holland, Isabel Clare, Glynis Murphy, and of course, Peter Kinsella. And it was the concept of supported decision-making that really drew me to the Act and its implementation. So it was really pioneering in its time, the Mental Capacity Act. So, however, as beautifully articulated by Liz Wilson on page 7, I think, of the book, supported decision-making became the forgotten gem of the Act. And it was the supported decision-making component that got me excited about the Act. But what we're seeing is that idea of supported decision-making is becoming lesser and lesser in practice in terms of the Mental Capacity Act. There is a whole lot of focus on assessment of capacity. Assessment, as Lucy was talking about, individual capacity, and not taking into account the role of support in that assessment. So it's this resource that I think has brought this new resource has brought the concept of supported decision-making back into light again, which is wonderful. So since my visit, the concept of a universal right to autonomy, the right that everyone can make decisions with support has emerged, and it's now fully embedded in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, to which Britain, the UK, is a signatory. So what that means is if you're a signatory, if a nation is a signatory to a UN convention, that means that that nation has an unequivocal obligation to ensure that what is written in that convention is implemented in that country. So this emergence around supported decision making has grown since that time, and championed by some really great people. Lucy's one of them, so it was wonderful to hear from you, Lucy. People like Eleanor Flynn and Gerard Quinn from Ireland, Anna Arstine Kerslake, who's now in Ireland, Michael Buck, Pierce Gooding in Australia, and Michelle Browning, Wayne Martin, who I'm sure many of you know. So just to name a few, there was many people that really drove this piece of work. And we really need to acknowledge these academics, these policymakers, these practitioners. But it's really, really important that we acknowledge people with disabilities, their families, and loved ones who for too long have not been heard, in my opinion. So as Lucy talked about, today in Australia and in most of the Western world, concepts relating to self-determination such as freedom, choice, autonomy are embraced, and they're really celebrated. The making of decisions is, it's ubiquitous to all parts of our life. And as Schwartz said, we live in a time and place where freedom and autonomy are valued above all else. So on this slide, I'm going to try, I didn't start doing it, but so I apologise, but I will try and describe the visual images on the screen. So there's a picture of a man who looks like he might be in his pajamas. He's looking a little perplexed by the amount of choice that he's faced with in a supermarket. So there's so much choice. Who do we have a relationship? What health interventions do we choose? Whether to pray, and if so, who to? What clothes to wear? But for so many of us, as Lucy said, we have the privilege of having that autonomy. On this slide is a little girl looking up at the sky, and she's leaning on a fence, I think. And there's the word autonomy there. So what does autonomy mean to you? If we break down that word, auto, it's meaning self, nomi, governance. So it's about our will, our preference, directing our life's path. Okay, so if you think about that very simply, it's about our will, our preferences, directing our own life's path. And I want you to think about what that can look like for people with profound and multiple learning disability. People who don't use speech to communicate, people who communicate informally. So how can we assist them to have their will and preference direct their own life's path? And there's no question, this is not a new concept. It's been discussed since antiquity. People like Plato and Aristotle, they've all had something quite substantial to say about this concept. So what they saw, and we still do today, they saw autonomy as something that defines our personhood. It is the essence of our humanity. It makes us uniquely human. So when we talk about what a human is, what a person is, we're talking about a self-determined person, a person who has autonomy. And this is a view that's really prominent today. Now, if we say that, if that is the case, that autonomy is clearly linked to our personhood, if we say that somebody cannot make a decision, what does that mean for their personhood? And there is plenty of people out there who believe that that is the case. What we know is, although we have so many choices and so much autonomy in perhaps our own lives, there are billions of people across the planet that continue to live lives that are far from autonomous. So what does that say about their personhood? And it's not only because of political sanctions, of war, poverty, natural disasters, slavery, torture, all those horrible things. There's people right near you in your neighbourhoods all over the world, people with intellectual disability or learning disability that are unable to choose what they eat, what they wear, where and with whom they live, who they have a relationship with. all of those things that I've listed help us define who we are as people. And so it's very important that we do all we can to make sure that all people have the right to live an autonomous life. So my research and practice has focused on why this is the case. Why are people getting left behind from the self-determination train? And what can we do about that? For me, I think it largely boils down to perceptions of decision-making capacity. So I think Sally talked about it in her introduction, that there are all over the place. People have perceptions that people with cognitive disability, intellectual disability, learning disability, dementia, acquired brain injury cannot make decisions and therefore aren't worthy of living a self-determined life. So moving on this slide is a complex sort of gathering of, it's one of those, you know, when you were kids, you used to cut with paper, you used to cut out pictures of people and then unfold the paper, and all of it's so all the pieces, there's pieces of paper all in a line. And the reason why I chose that picture for this point is to emphasize that autonomy is, for me, it's relational. It is also very fragile. So these are pictures of people who are, you know, very papery and fragile. Now, Article 12, I'm going to say that article again because it's a very, very important article. So Lucy talked a lot about the Mental Capacity Act. I'm coming up internationally and talking about the UNCRPD and what that says for us as signatory nations to the convention. Article 12 says very, very, very clearly that everyone has a right to autonomy and everyone has a right to be seen as a person before the law. So not only is this connection between autonomy and personhood seen in everyday life, it's also reflected in the law. And I'll leave the law to Lucy to talk about, so I'll move on from that. So what Article 12 says is that the right to autonomy is central. It's key to our personhood. And the other clear mandate of Article 12 is that not only have all citizens of a signatory nation the right to autonomy, regardless of disability, but a right to be supported to realise that autonomy. And this is where this concept of supported decision making came in. And this was an absolute paradigm shift in the way we thought about autonomy, because no longer in legislation or international legislation was there was the right to autonomy reflected. Now it said, yes, everyone has the right to autonomy, but most importantly for people with cognitive disability is that they have the right to be supported to exercise that. So that's the really important part. So what has come for me, I've really focused on what that support can look like. Now, it's important to highlight that there is a view, and this is something that's, you know, difficult to hear, but it is a very clear view from renowned bioethicists who, you know, I possibly don't need to name, a profound view that personhood and therefore autonomy is not a right that people with intellectual disability should necessarily possess. And this is for one very simple reason. Many ethicists tend to consider cognitive capacity to be the key to full personhood. They use the indicator of cognitive ability to distinguish between those with legal personhood and those without. So to be a person, to have that identity as a person, you need to have a cognitive ability. Now, Paradigm's new resource, it challenges that view. It takes the stance that decision-making capacity is not dependent on a person's cognition, but rather the amount and type of support they get to to make those decisions. So it asks us to reconceptualize this idea of capacity and this idea of personhood. And so this reconceptualizing of decision-making capacity. This was a quote way back in 2000 from Values into Action in Scotland, that has already been mentioned, as pioneers, I guess, of starting to think about supported decision making. And what they've said is the starting point is not a test of capacity. The starting point is not a test of capacity, but the presumption that every human being is communicating all the time and that this communication will include preferences. Preferences can be built up into expressions of choice and these into formal decisions. So from this perspective, where someone lands on a continuum of capacity is not half as important as the amount and the type of support they get to build preferences into choices. So that quote, really, simple quote, back in 2000, it struck a chord with me. It really was that quote that made me think differently about the group of people that I'd been supporting as a speech pathologist most of my career, people with PMLD. So I started to think differently. I started to say to the psychologists that I was working with, hey, when you go in and you assess capacity, could we have that person's circle of support around them? Could we assess their capacity to make a decision with support rather than assessing their capacity to make a decision? Because as Lucy beautifully said, none of us make decisions without the guidance from people who know and love us. And, I think about myself. I think about, I never make a decision without consulting everyone in the room. But the irony is, for the people that I support, they're seen, if they need to consult or have support, they're seen as incompetent decision makers. But when I consult with everyone in the room, I'm seen as a real team player, Oh, she's so collaborative. She's amazing. But the people with learning disability that we support have to jump through hoops without that support. They're assessed based on their individualized capacity to make decisions. And if somebody assessed me on that, I would certainly be an incompetent decision maker. So moving on. No, I will say a little bit more here because I think it's really important. So I think we are faced with this question around what is decision-making capacity. And I think the answer lies in the way we understand this thing called autonomy. I think we're misguided if we think that autonomy is an individualized pursuit. I think the only way a person's autonomy can be truly realized is with support. So support from people in their lives who know and love them. In our little great breakouts session, I hope Carolyn won't mind, that this idea of circles of support came up, and we spoke about how important the idea of not one person supporting someone to make a decision, but a group, a circle of support. That decision making can be really collaborative. And if we think back to what I was saying about my own Indigenous country people, Australian Aboriginals, what we know is that even now, decisions are not made individually. They're made as a collective. So, so if everyone is to lead this autonomous life that we all talk about, what can that support look like? And this is what I'm going to talk to you about with the rest of my time. I'm all confused by the time change. I think it's 8:20 my time. Yes, 8:20 my time. Is that right? I think so.
15 minutes. 16 minutes. Okay.
Okay. 16 minutes. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Perfect. So I want you to start thinking about autonomy differently. I want you to start thinking about autonomy beyond cognition. So rather than taking that view that the psychologists that I had worked with in the past would say, okay, well, we need to make sure that they understand cause and effect. We need to make sure they understand this cognitive thing called object permanence, means end behavior. That if this happens, then this happens. So what I'm asking people to do, or what I asked my psychology colleagues to do, was to think about what aspects that make someone human. And I'm going to focus on one of these things called relational autonomy. So on this slide is about 30 African kids, and they're sitting around a circle with their feet facing inwards. It's very lovely. And it promotes a really positive view of relational autonomy. Now, I'm going to read a definition of relational autonomy and how it applies to supported decision-making. Because for me, I think this is the essence of what we're talking about when we're talking about supported decision-making, particularly for people with profound multiple learning disabilities. So the traditional notion of autonomy is involving self-sufficient independence, and boundaries against others is unhelpful. Instead of rejecting it, autonomy can and ought to be reframed around the idea that self-determination is consonant with the importance of the role of others in relation to that self. So think about your own life. We all make decisions as a collective. We don't all, but we could do more of it, I think. And I often think of the wonderful Billy Bragg, who I sometimes say to myself, there is indeed power in a union, and it's not only about collective change, but it's certainly about decision making. So moving on to this quick discussion of risks. So we can't talk about decision making without reflecting on risks. Risks must be taken because the greatest hazard in life is to risk nothing. The person who risks nothing, does nothing, has nothing, is nothing. He may avoid suffering and sorrow, but he cannot learn, feel, change, grow, or live. Chained by his servitude, he's a slave who has forfeited all freedom. Only a person who risks is free. I don't even know when that was written, but I think it's a very old quote. So, I'm having trouble with this. Here we go. So, when I ask myself why I feel okay about making decisions that are risky, I think about the supports that I have around me, of people that I trust, of people that I know will pick me up when I fall. And I think about the people that you know and love with intellectual disability. Do they have support to experience uncertainty, to take risks, and by so doing, develop preferences, likes and dislikes? We don't know what we like or don't like unless we can experience them. And this idea of attempting to make life risk-free, it really robs people of potential opportunities. But what we know from our research is that despite the fact that we all see the positives in risk-taking in life, that what I've seen in my research, I'm going to show you some data, that where a person's cognitive disability is greater, the less likely they are to be supported to make decisions. So on this next slide, I can work out the thing, is a picture of a pavlova. Some of you might know what a pav is, I'm sure you do. There's an argument, Carolyn from New Zealand is on the call. There's an argument as to whose dessert it actually is, whether it's New Zealand's or Australians. But the truth is, it is New Zealand's. So don't let any Aussies tell you otherwise. But I put this on the slide to demonstrate some of this data. So I had two people with who didn't use speech to communicate. One had a profound and multiple learning disability. The other did not had a very mild disability, intellectual disability. So they were both faced with the same decision. And that decision was whether or not they had a PEG inserted. So a gastrostomy tube that goes into their tummy and food goes in. And it's a big decision health-wise. Now, the same support worker answered both these. So I asked, tell me about the decision that Kev's faced with. And she said, it was hard. Kev loves his food. I mean, he really loves his food, hey guys. So we knew what he would prefer. But he had so many bouts of pneumonia and he gets so sick. Remember that Christmas he was in hospital, the poor love? But we weighed things up and it was clear that he wanted to eat orally. So even though he now has the PEG, we let him take risks and eat most days. You know, just teeny tiny tastes. It's just really important to him. So it's worth the risk. I mean, how much does he love his mum's pav? So that's one fella who has a mild intellectual disability. Right? So they're prepared to support him to take a risk to have the PEG, to not have the PEG inserted. Okay. So now he's just going to, oh, no, sorry. They have supported him to have the tube put in, but they are happy to support him to eat orally. Okay. Because when you have a PEG, you can eat orally as well. But then this is the fellow with PMLD. Well, he was aspirating all the time. So that means that the food's going through his trachea into his lungs. It was just too risky. We had no choice. He was always in hospital with pneumonia. Now, even if he could participate in the decision, he would have had no say. It had to go in, you know, it was life and death. As Tina the Speechy, that's a speech pathologist, that's just the way it had to be. So what we're seeing here is a very different approach to risk taking for people, depending on their cognitive capacity or their perception of cognitive capacity. And so we saw lots of examples of this in our data. I'm going to go very quickly through this because I think that I've probably got 10 minutes or so left. So this is a model of supported decision making for people with PMLD that I've come up with through my research. It's very, very simple. There's two roles within this supported decision making process for this group of people. The role of the person is simply to express their will and preference, right? That is all they're doing it all the time, right? The role of the supporter is to respond to that expression of preference by acknowledging, interpreting, and then acting on that preference. So how many times, for those of you who know people living in residential care, do you go into a house or a service and you see somebody communicating something unintentionally or informally? So they might be in the corner rocking, okay? The majority of the people in the room ignore that communication. So what we want people to do, and this is what we're doing in our training, is get people to acknowledge when someone is communicating. And most people are communicating all the time. So we need people to acknowledge that someone is communicating, then interpret. So that interpretation is really important, but that interpretation needs to happen collaboratively. And then we act on that preference. Okay, but we do this as a circle of support and we use a whole lot of different tools to do that. You'll see on my slides, there's a QR code every now and again. If you just scan your phone on that, it'll take you to the research that is talking about that research. And I'll send you, I'll share my slides. So if you can't get your phone up in time, that's fine. Where are we? So this is the model. There's three things that the supporter has to do: acknowledge, interpret, and then act. Importantly, that interpretation needs to happen collaboratively with a group of people. Like Carolyn was saying in our group before, a group of people who know this person well. Now, I'm not going to go through all this, but this is the larger model. So what we wanted to know, if the role of the supporter is so important, what impacts that role? So there's a whole lot of things, and there's a whole lot of papers you can read if you feel like it, if you want to put yourself to sleep, but that talk about these factors that are really important. Now, the one factor I'm going to talk about in the time I've got left is this idea of storytelling. So think about the people that you know and love with PMLD. Think about the stories, no, I'll take that back. Think about the people that you work with. Think about the stories you share with one another. Those stories that you share on Monday morning. For me, in living in a city called Melbourne, AFL, Australian Rules Football, mad. So every Monday morning, most people talk about what happened in the footy. So you get a glimpse of who someone is, who their family is, who's important to them. And that's all about telling stories. So, you know, I went to the footy and this happened and then blah, blah, blah. So you get to know someone. And what we're trying to do here is get to know someone. What we know is that people are more responsive when they know somebody well. They're more responsive to their communication. So we need to really build up this knowledge of a person. And Nicola Grove, I'd encourage you to look at Nicola Grove's work. Many of you will know Nick. I think she's still living in Wiltshire somewhere. She's a speech pathologist with a lot of experience, and she's done a whole lot of work around storytelling with this group. Stories tell the world we are here. They are the essence of getting to know someone. Storytelling is so important. We are all storytellers. We all live in a network of stories. There isn't a stronger connection between people than storytelling. So how can we support people with PMLD to tell stories? I'd encourage you to look at Nicola's work. And also, this is some research that I've done recently around developing narratives of who people are. So it allows people to get a sense of someone's personhood. So often we will document things around, you know, how we care for someone, how we support them to go to the toilet, how we, you know, what they like and dislike. But what I've done is asked people who know people well, some very simple questions. If Sim had complete control over their life, what clothes would they wear? What car would they drive? What music would they listen to? What food would they eat? Where would they go on holiday? Now, it's really simple questions, but what we've been able to do is almost develop a biography of each person, not about how we support them to have a shower, but how we support them to live a life of their preferences. So what we get from that are narratives like, so if Kevin had control over the stereo in the bus, what would it look like? What would he listen to? Oh yeah, he likes some like rock type music, like AC/DC. Yeah, something with a bit of guts. And then the other person said, yeah, you're right, something with guts, loud, loud, loud. Yeah, louder the better, hey Kev. A deep, heavy bass line, don't you reckon? Nirvana or even Primus. Now, interesting, because the reason why I was involved in Kevin's life is because he had some behaviours of concern in the bus, going from the day service to home, right? He was banging his head on the window. So they tell me this. Then I get in the bus and go for a ride, and he's banging his head and he's very distressed. What is on the radio? What is on the music in the bus? What are they playing? They're not playing any of this. They're playing John Denver. You know, so it's really important that we get people to think outside someone's disability and, you know, ask, what would their life be like if she had control over her life? Oh, he'd be really comfortable but stylish. He wouldn't wear those tracky dacks. Tracky dacks in Australia are tracksuit pants. I think he would be quite social. He has that Scottish sense of humour. He would have to have a very fast car. I always thought he'd be a courier or something like that. So why aren't we embracing those activities for him? That's another QR code of a paper that was published around using this technique for end-of-life care for people with profound and multiple learning disability, and how we've been able to develop narrative for these people that then can be reflected in their palliative care. So it's almost like an advanced care plan. I've nearly finished. I'm sure Sally's thinking, oh, only got minutes left. This idea of interpretive supports. I'm doing some work with Michael Buck and Erin Sheldon in Canada, and also Wayne Martin in Essex, around this idea of interpretive supports. So what we're doing is using hours and hours and hours of footage of video and helping people, and then coming together as a circle of support, as a collaborative, and using that to support that person to make a decision. So this is Tom. He is someone who is struggling with what to do on the weekend, right? So seems very bored on the weekend. He makes a certain noise that we know that he's bored. He does a lot of eye gouging when he's bored, and we're seeing lots of that. So what we decided to do was, so we acknowledged that he was bored. So we're going back to that responsiveness: acknowledge, interpret, respond. So we acknowledged that he was bored. We interpreted, we then needed to go to that interpretive stage. So we took him out over a period of 6 weeks, and we went to a whole lot of different places and we filmed him. Then we came back together and made a decision about how he would spend his time. So this is him feeling a corrugated iron shed that can get very hot in summer in Australia. So this is his support worker. What we did then came back as a collective. So he's moving away. Okay. And we watched these videos forensically. So we'd stop and pause. No, I think he's trying to get away from her fingers there. Oh, I think she likes that, or he doesn't like that. So we're getting a very, very forensic view of what he's telling us. And
good sis Erin. Woo! Go Erin! Yay!
So this man was the one, when I talked about before, seeing him beyond his disability supports. They said he likes fast cars, he likes movement. So we used those narratives to come up with a list of things he might like. And so that's why we took him to this park. He had never been on a ride, but it was very clear from what we saw from his behaviour after this video. We all looked at it. There was 3 of us there at the park. He chose to spend, well, he didn't. We supported him then to spend his money on the same ride, to have another ride. And he had another ride and another ride and another ride. And we were able to reflect on that on the way home. And there's no question who was the author of that decision about how he spent his money that day. It wasn't us. We were there till the damn place closed, and we didn't want to be. It was cold Melbourne winter, and so that to me was really important. So we have a whole heap of video like this that we use to forensically analyze, I guess. This is a TED talky thing that I did a while back. If you're interested in this technique, it's just quick 10 minutes, and you can explore how, it's a lot clearer than me tonight explaining the technique a little bit more. So congratulations, Paradigm, and your wonderful partners and allies. This resource is a change maker. It really, really is. It's providing much needed guidance to those who we know and love and support, people with intellectual disability, to live an autonomous life. It's really important. And as I said in the beginning, I don't know if I did say in the beginning, I meant to say in the beginning, I think one of the really important things about this guide is that it doesn't pretend that support and decision making is easy. It doesn't say it's not rocket science. because it is rocket science. It's hard. There are so many different pieces to this puzzle. So congratulations, and thank you for inviting me to join you. I'll stop sharing now.
Jo, thank you
Yeah.
so much. I'm sure I'm speaking for others. I could listen to for an awful lot longer, but amazing. I would really recommend going to the link. We will share the links that Jo has shared to make sure people have as much access to Jo's thinking and work of, well, your work and that of colleagues and friends as well to share. Amazing. So we have time now for a breakout group again, another one in the form of you connecting, chatting with people who are here. The question we're posing, we should go to this, and I'm going to let, it's probably about 10 minutes now, which is fine. The question is, what one thing can you do following today that means you're supporting people even better to live their lives and be in control? Or what one thing can you do for your life to make sure you are in control of your life? Okay, so that's the question we pose to you now. So go away, have a group breakout chat, and we'll be
Do you want to pause?
And
suddenly abruptly stop people's conversations. Wonderful. Are we back, Sam and Rachel?
yes, we are.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone. Sorry that with the power of the button again, we stopped your conversations slightly shorter than you may have expected. But we're very conscious of your time. And we just, Michelle, what are we going to do now? What are we going to do
So
now?
we're going to go. I've forgotten. All right, we're going to show you a tour of the practical guide, but not a lot, but just short snippets of the resources.
So really just giving you a flavour. Some of you have already found the link is live on our website. We will be putting the link in the chat very shortly and inviting you to share it. We're just going to highlight some of the ways we, or our colleague Jo really, based on the work with our co-production partners, the ways we've tried to make the resource interactive and useful and very practical. It's about action and knowledge. Action is very important. Okay. So we have an introductory page, and we really want to acknowledge our partners here. So we have named our co-production colleagues here, amazing people that gave up their time for naught other than determination to try and make a difference here and shift people's thinking and practice. And there's a dedication in the book as well that Michelle's going to read out.
This booklet is dedicated to all those whose right is to be supported in making decisions as being ignored or not upheld. It is dedicated to all those families whose unconditional love for their family member drives all their support they give, and to all those supporters who are passionate about getting it right. We see you.
Thank you. There is a contents page. We color coded it. There are 3 sections. The introduction, opening words from Lucy, thank you, Lucy, and why we produced the guide. What color is that? Green. I'm going to call that green. is a key aspect of supported decision making as it fits in the law, highlighting what we must know and must share and must uphold. And then section 3, the turquoisey section, is tools and thinking. And we're just going to introduce a little bit there. We use quotes that really focus people's thinking at the start of each section. Michelle.
Knowledge is power, information is liberation, education is the premise of progress in every society, in every family.
So again, the guide's there to download for free and use. You can screenshot things to use in presentations and conversations. We want you to use this openly and freely to spread the word and change behaviours in all of us. So we look at, don't we, Michelle?
Yeah. What is supported decision making?
So there's information there with a message we've heard already from Lucy, Sue and Joe. It's about person being in control in the driving seat of their life. And we do mean, as Joe says, all means all. Every living, breathing human being has the right to be supported and to be heard in whatever way they need to be heard and understood.
Why are people ignoring supported decision making?
We started developing this resource and being prompted by colleagues around the country, but also based on real concern that Michelle and I see and our colleagues see every day, where we don't think people are really always doing a good job in exploring what's possible for and with each single person we know in our lives. And there are traps that people fall into. So in the conversations with our co-production partners, there were loads of things, a massive list. So we had to capture some of the traps that were identified by people. Michelle, there are 3 on here that you think are really ones that you see regularly when we're out working together.
Yep. Presuming what people want, not knowing the person well enough to be able to support them, and assuming someone doesn't use words, cannot communicate. To use words cannot communicate.
We love support workers. We run the Great Support Movement. Everything we do is ensuring people are really encouraged to do their best, but we regularly hear this person can't communicate because, or this person can't make a decision because. We know that's not true. Joe and Lucy and others have powerfully said that today, but we do hear it, don't we, Michelle? So we know there are 5 principles. We know that thanks to Sue and Lucy, that's been highlighted. So we won't read this one out, but as Lucy said, we focus primarily on the 2nd principle, the support principle. We have summarised some of the law, Michelle, haven't we?
Yes.
And I'm going to say again, we ain't lawyers, are we?
No.
No, but this is factually correct because thanks to Lucy and other colleagues, there is information here that will help. Whenever you see a blue line, it is a hyperlink to a resource or a legal document or a case or an act that will be helpful. We have described clearly here that this booklet applies to England and Wales, but similar practices fit in to the Scottish legislative framework. It's slightly different in Scotland, it's explained here, but the principle of supported decision-making is universal, as we've heard from Joe and others today. So anything in blue, click, it works, it will take you to more information. This slide we're just showing, if you see this easy read sign here, so throughout the resource, there's a symbol, this easy read symbol. Whenever you click something near there, you will find something that has been designed to be easier to understand. So do look out for that symbol in the resource as well. We weren't going to read this one out, were we, Michelle?
No.
No,
No.
because we've already heard from Joe, haven't we?
Yes, we have. And
But-
it's very powerful on what she was talking about.
Really powerful, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But again, we are consistent throughout this resource that all means all. How people communicate is our job to understand their communication, to understand their story, to explore what life is possible, what life they want. So again, a hyperlink here to some of Joe's work, so do use that. Section 3 starts with another quote.
This section has lots of things in it to help you when you are supporting someone to make their decision.
Absolutely.
By failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail.
Wow, powerful, Michelle. This real thing, you cannot walk into a room with someone you don't know and support them to make a decision. You can't do it. It's impossible. Joe has just talked about the fact we have relationships with people. We have to deeply know somebody's story. And in the resource, we absolutely say a circle of support or some way of knowing who's important to the person, knowing their life story, their hopes and dreams is really, really important. So there's a hyperlink here to information that might help you. And Kate, I think this is your son, isn't it? Kate Chait, you there? Whoa, is she there still? Don't know. Oh, I'll move on. But okay, so absolutely.
Yes, it is.
It is. Thank you, Kate. I thought it was. So really important, circles of support, some way of getting to know the person, fundamental. Otherwise, you cannot do this at all. You cannot support somebody without knowing. So then the guide just goes through the steps that will take you from thinking about, is there a decision that someone needs support to make? We will just guide you through. Very simple, very visually. Anytime there's a blue link, click it. It might be too much for you. It might be helpful. You can dip in, dip out. If you've got a particular situation, use it in the way that works for the person you're supporting, for you and your family, whatever.
Pause for reflection.
So
we're going to watch a small video or listen to a small clip.
we are. So there are 16 stories in here that are true stories from people. Sue said earlier, one of them is a story from someone she knows. 16 stories gathered from people with learning disabilities, families and supporters. And when you go, you click onto it, you can read it or you can listen to the recording. So we're going to play this 2-minute one.
Yeah, and just before we do, could everyone put themselves on mute so you might get a better sound?
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
This is Akuba. Akuba lives with her paid carer. Akuba is not very happy living with her paid carer anymore. Her carer was nice, but Akuba wanted to follow her dream to live on her own. Her carer was against the idea, didn't think it would work. Akuba had a circle of support where people she liked met together to support her. They help her make decisions in life. Akuba's sister was not in her circle of support as they didn't get on well. At their next meeting, Akuba asked for their help. Her circle of support suggested they did a path planning session. This helped Akuba think about what she wanted in the future. The different people in the circle brought different skills and knowledge to help Akuba do this. They agreed how to help Akuba move out. After thinking about what is possible and a lot of emotional conversations and planning, Akuba moved into her own flat 9 years later. Yeah. The end. Here are a few questions for you to think about. How did Akuba's circle of support help Akuba? How could a circle of support help you? Who would you have on your circle of support? What would you like them to help you make decisions on?
Okay, so
This is Akuba.
Whoops, sorry.
Akuba lives with her
Narrated by my wonderful colleague sitting to my left, your right probably. 16 stories in there. Think about how you can use them with people with learning disabilities, families, in conversations with your family friends, in team meetings with support workers. How could you use those? They're there to use for free, so please do make the most of them. And then we're coming to the end of this little tour now, just to say that smattered throughout the resource are some forms. We're not great lovers of paperwork at Paradigm. We're all about conversations and discovery and curiosity. But there are times when we absolutely do need to record how we have supported somebody and what decisions have been made and what steps needed next. The forms that were designed by our colleague Jo guide you through the thinking process with the person you're supporting to make a decision. and they will hopefully capture all the elements you should be capturing in order to do your best to support people. So again, click on the hyperlinks, you will be able to download the forms. You can also see here a link to a legal case, which is really, really helpful. There are also links to resources that other people have created. So this is one that Lucy developed with artists Grace Curry, Viv and Chris from the Helter Skelter Company. Really powerful film, bringing to life Lucy's book, actually, I mentioned earlier. But again, you can click on there. And the closing words in the book.
Wow, that's been a lot of information, but information is power. Information is empowers. Information is powerless, even if not applied.
I love working with Michelle. You can see the energy Michelle brings when we travel. So, Michelle. Okay.
Today's the launch of the practical guide, and it's now on the website.
Yeah.
Yay.
Some of you have found the website. Some mysteriously found an old link, which is panicking me. I'll find it and delete it. Rachel, if you want to share the link now, that'd be wonderful. We really encourage you to share it widely and let us know what you think, get feedback. We will keep exploring ideas, having more conversations about bringing to life supported decision making and ensuring we do better with and for people across the world. Let's be brave, not just in the UK. Going to hand over for a minute or so to our colleague Katie to tell you about some training, and then we have a final challenge before you go. So if you're still there, stay with us for 3 minutes.
Thank you. A minute and counting. Yeah, well, just to say very briefly that Liz Wilson, whose fault it is, rather inspired us to get this guide updated. Liz and I have written some training. So there's a training day offer. It will be a practical day. We'll be using the guide totally to go, for our training purposes. We will be looking at some of the forms and practicing, thinking about the decisions that we make daily. And I think it was Lucy that said about decision-making spaces. So what we want to do is to create opportunities for people to develop their confidence to help other people expand their decision-making spaces. And just thinking about what Joe said about it actually is rocket science, but with this guide, it can be made a whole lot easier and just really open up people's lives. So the information will be on the website, Sally, won't it? And we'll be sharing that. One final thought about the training: it will be co-facilitated by one of our colleagues with lived experience, but I don't think anybody can actually match the duo that Sally and Michelle are. It's been put in the chat, so it's official, but it will be co-facilitated. We know lived experience.
We know Chris is here as well, and he's amazing.
Yeah, well, yeah, Christopher, no names, no pack drill, but you're in.
Thank you. The final things we have to say, just very quickly. Very quickly, we're nearly finished, but Katie, it's your birthday today.
Happy birthday.
Yeah, so happy birthday, Katie. Katie works up in Yorkshire, is amazing support to so many people, so often ignored. So thank you, Katie, for everything. And
happy birthday, Katie.
Happy birthday to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Final comment, Michelle.
Right. It is important for people with a learning disability to be supported to make their own decisions. For me, it's about having control of my life. They are my choices to make, and it's my right to do what is right.
Thank you, Michelle.
So we'd like to leave you with one question. Are you going to be a gatekeeper and a life controller, or an upholder and a campaigner for people's rights? It's over to you.
So it's over to you. In the chat now, you will see a link to a Menti. It'll come in any minute. And the question, what's the one thing you're going to do following today, just being challenged by Lucy, Sue and Joe? What's the challenge? What are you going to do differently to ensure people are supported to be really making decisions about their lives?
Or a
right?
QR.
Yeah, or the QR codes there again. Aren't we getting trendy? Okay.
Excuse me, Sally, can you go back one slide? Because I really liked that. Yeah,
That- yeah,
your picture, sorry.
thank you. That one, yeah?
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.
Okay. Oh, I love it when people chip in like that. Great. Okay. Brilliant. Was that Wendy, was it? Recognise, oh, I don't know.
Wendy's on someone else's computer because Wendy's computer came back to life and put her in Australia. I was upside down, so.
So that's it from us. Just a huge thank you to everybody for joining us today.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us today.